It is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote presenters for today. Dr. Kristen Gillespie-Lynch received her PhD in developmental psychology from UCLA. She's an associate professor of psychology at the College of Staten Island and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Guided by collaborations with autistic people, she co-constructs and evaluates interventions to empower autistic adolescents and adults and reduce stigma. She directs a participatory mentorship program for autistic college students at CUNY, Building Bridges Project Reach, and leads a participatory NSF-funded study that aims to help autistic youth learn employment-related skills by helping educators learn from their students how to better engage them in informal, technology-focused learning opportunities. Given that many of the challenges autistic people face arise from misconceptions about autism, she and her collaborators develop and evaluate autism training internationally. She is honored to be an advisor to INSAR's Autistic Researchers Committee. I would also like to introduce her co-presenter, Daniel Batkin. Daniel Batkin is an autistic PhD student at CUNY studying developmental psychology under Dr. Kristen Gillespie-Lynch. Previously, Daniel received his bachelor's degree in psychology from Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York. His current research thesis is a 3-part study about the relationship between stimming and special interests. Currently, Daniel is developing the methodology for the second part, which will be a survey about stimming and special interests administered to 44 autistic high school and college students who will be participating in Kristen's game design and employment workshop. Being autistic has highly influenced Daniel's work, as it affords him insider knowledge and lived experience of autism and its many traits. Please welcome our first keynote speaker, Dr. Kristen Gillespie-Lynch.
Thank you so much for having us. We're really honored to be here and just delighted to see the work that you're doing here. It's really impressive, and it's something we'll bring back as a model for CUNY. And so this quote here we'll return to later, but this is this tension between recognizing strengths associated with autism and also developing support that will help people thrive and realize those strengths. And Daniel and I will be presenting here, and you'll see a clip from Wisdom, who graduated from Project Reach this year, later in the talk. And so we wanted to start with this accessibility check-in, which my collaborator T.C. Wasteman always starts with. So does everyone feel comfortable in this beautiful space? Wonderful. And this is the structure of our talk. I'm going to go a little bit quickly, so if I'm ever going too quickly for anyone, just raise your hand to slow me down, because we have a lot of slides. And we wanted to start by introducing ourselves.
Hi, I'm Daniel. Up there is a lot of stuff that I don't usually tell everybody right out front. The most important ones for this are that I'm autistic, obviously, as Christopher mentioned. I'm a PhD student at CUNY, and I'm a Buddhist practitioner and a self-advocate.
And I view myself as a citizen of the world. I've lived a lot of different places, including Indonesia and Alaska and Indiana, which puts me in between communities. And I also have a lot of neurodivergent family members and close friends, including my husband and brother. And I also struggle a lot with time management, to the point that I probably would have been diagnosed with ADHD earlier in development if I were growing up now. And we wanted to know who else is here. So if people would be comfortable raising your hand if you openly identify as neurodivergent. Wonderful, thank you. And would people who are educators raise your hand? Wonderful. Administrators? And this is really important that administrators are present here, because that often in these types of talks, we don't always have this level of presence, and this is really important for the types of systems change we're seeing here. And clinicians? Wonderful, thank you. And apologies if I didn't bring up your identity. And so as we've already talked about, the number of autistic college students is increasing, And there's a lot of blossoming and wonderful research in this area, but some of it has contributed to really stigmatizing misconceptions that contribute to people not identifying as autistic or neurodivergent until they run into challenges that can make it harder to recover. And so one of the key things that we think is really important for making research not contribute to the problems it's trying to address is using a participatory approach, or collaborating with the people you seek to serve in developing and disseminating the research. And so our project is also funded by the FAR Fund, Project Reach, and it's at 8 CUNY campuses now. It started at 5 10 years ago, and we're representing one of the CUNY campuses at the College of Staten Island. And our approach, it seems, is quite similar in a lot of ways to the approach here. We work on providing direct support and then also educating community members. And so we provide a very adaptive approach to mentorship, so people can sign up for one-on-one mentorship or group mentorship. And there's 2 different types of groups. One is a structured skills development group, and one is a creative exploration group where students make art together. That's become one of our more popular groups. We started it during the pandemic, when we realized that we needed to build opportunities for community. And our approach is participatory, so autistic students can become mentors from the beginning, as was the case with Daniel. He's one of the group leaders. Or people can start out as a mentee and become a mentor, or public speaker, or researcher, or people can just stay mentees the whole time, depending on what approach they prefer. And we're constantly learning from students. And this is a clip from Jin, who actually reached out to me from Hunter College when Hunter did not yet have a Project Reach. It currently has one that's starting up. And he reached out to me after a year of being very nervous to reach out to me, and finally did, and became a mentee, and then grew to be one of our most powerful leaders of the skills development group, and just an incredible researcher on this and our other project as well. And with these clips, I'm going to just share part of them in the interest of time. So we're going to play this by ear. So if we can start this, and then I'll raise my hand when to stop it. And I'm the queen of technical issues. So when I came in and heard that I was not going to be able to press the video, I was like, oh no, this is good.
Hi, I'm Jim, an honor student at Hunter College who works collaboratively with Dr. Kristen Gillespie-Lynch and Ariana Riccio at Project Reach. Ariana's my mentor and she's really cool. So, a little bit about me. I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome in 2014, but at the time I didn't know anything about it. To me, autistic people were Rain Man or the kids in special ed classes, not me. It took a while for me to gather more information about autism spectrum disorder, largely through online communities and reading books, especially Neurotribes by Steve Silberman. And by the time I was facing the logistical problem of college. So when I got to college, I discovered that Hunter provides academic accommodations to individuals through their Office of Accessibility, but that wasn't quite what I was looking for. I was looking for a sense of purpose, like I wanted to do something with autism research, something that I could contribute to. And so through one of my professors, I was put into contact with Dr. Siller, who gave me Dr. Lynch's contact information, and since then, I've been better able to find my niche.
And if we could stop this
So
here.
one of the coolest things...
And we'll hear more from Jin and see more of his work throughout the talk. It may not move forward now. Perfect. And now you're going to hear from Wisdom, who just graduated from Lehman College. And so Lehman is another CUNY campus, but Wisdom joined our program as well because there wasn't at that time a Project Reach at Lehman. They're currently developing one there as well. And so Wisdom wanted to record this for the talk. And we're going to play this full clip. And you can start it whenever you like.
Hello, everyone. My name is Wisdom George, and I have just graduated from Lehman College last week on the first day of June on Thursday. What led me to graduate to earn my bachelor's degree is how I managed to make a good effort in order to succeed in my classes and my classmates understand me about who I am. All of that came to pass because of what I've learned from Project Reach for 3 years. I learned how to form relationships by befriending the person, spending time with him or her, being honest and open-minded with the person you're bonding with, and you also must be a good listener while being respectful. As part of Project Reach, I became a collaborator on a photo voice study led by Ellie Grossman, a PhD student. What I learned from the photo voice meeting from Ellie Grossman is how to channel my emotions in order to keep a job. I must not snap back at my boss or quarrel with my coworkers, and I must be patient with my customers. Every customer that might come into the store. Those 3 things will help me look for a job if my mindset is in the right kind of behavior. One of the things I like about Project Reach is how my friends I made, such as Victoria DeSantis, Jin Delos Santos, and Cianta Zapata. Even though I graduated, I am going to keep in touch with Project Reach and keep my friends from that said group forever. That is all.
So I'm going to take over for this part. Here we're going to explain some terms used by neurodiversity advocates. Dr. Mary Doherty is an autistic anesthesiologist and the founder of Autistic Doctors International. She identified a problem known as neurodiversity light, in which researchers, clinicians, and other professionals in the autism world use the terms set forth by the neurodiversity movement without actually understanding them, or without actually pairing them, the use of these terms, with tangible neurodiversity affirmative actions. And she stresses that if you want to use the neurodiversity affirmative language, you should also know what it means, and I personally think that you should also translate it into tangible action, which I'm seeing quite a lot of at RCAS. So the medical model of disability takes a very deficit-based approach. It's very pathological, very disease-oriented, and the main goal of this model is to normalize or to cure autism and other conditions. So what exactly is neurodiversity? Much like neurodiversity, as defined by Singer and Bloom, is the diversity of all brains and all minds. It's much like biodiversity of all life on Earth. So neurodiversity was actually based on the concept of biodiversity. And we think of biodiversity as good, right? So Singer and Bloom felt that we as a society should feel the same about neurodiversity. There are different terms that are part of neurodiversity as a concept, and they each have their own meaning. Neurodiversity is the limitless variability of all brains and all minds. Neurodivergence, which sometimes gets confused with neurodiversity, is a state of being in which one's neurology, brain structure, their mind, is different from what society views as normal. So when people whose neurology doesn't fit with society's view of normal will often call themselves neurodivergent rather than neurodiverse. We're all neurodiverse, so everyone's neurodiverse. So no one person can be neurodiverse, but one person can be neurodivergent. And intersectionality is the compounding and combining of different forms of societal discrimination that affect marginalized people. So, for example, someone who identifies as a woman of color would experience intersectional discrimination. When did people start considering neurodiversity through an intersectional lens? Probably right from the very beginning. Judy Singer, who first coined the term neurodiversity, had always intended for it to be a political term, a name for a civil rights movement focusing on neurological minorities, and also as a form of intersectionality. She didn't intend for it to be used in a medical model way, as a diagnostic term, nor as a synonym for neurological disorder. And a key tenet of neurodiversity is that all humans are neurodiverse, just like all plants are neurodiverse. So are biodiverse, not neurodiverse. So it's not an us and them situation. There's no us, there's no them, there's no divisions in anything. We're all in this together. The neurodiversity movement is primarily a civil rights movement that arose from the framework provided by the concept of neurodiversity. Its original focus was solely on autism, and recognizing it as a minority identity and a natural part of the human condition rather than a disease or disorder. And since then, it's widened to include all neurodivergent people, such as those with ADHD, OCD, other conditions. Its aims are full societal inclusion of all neurodivergent people, the rejection of normal as a treatment goal, shifts in support methods to coping skills and quality of life supports, and it also includes very diverse perspectives, so there's no singular manifesto for the neurodiversity movement.
Thank you, Daniel. And so the neurodiversity movement has led to an ongoing paradigm shift that's really, really exciting and that we're seeing happen here. And so over the course of my career, I've seen the way that autism is talked about shift dramatically in a lot of spaces, but not obviously in all. And these ideas have quickly spread to other movements, other disability communities, as Daniel mentioned, and are leading to paradigm shifts there. But who the neurodiversity movement represents remains a really key bone of contention. And so this is a clip from Christopher Constantino, who's a stuttering researcher and clinician and stutterer, who reached out to me in 2019 to ask me to speak at the National Stuttering Association, which is actually where I met Judy Singer. And I hadn't even had any idea at that point in time that ideas from the neurodiversity movement were being adopted in the stuttering community in similar ways as in the autism community. So a lot of advocacy moving the field forward, and then a lot of pushback from other people in the community that questioned the neurodiversity approach. And so we're just going to play some of Chris's speech here.
Hello, my name is Christopher Constantino. I'm a speech-language pathologist and an assistant professor at Florida State University. I work clinically with people who stutter. I study stuttering, and I'm a stutterer myself. Stuttering is not often associated with the neurodiversity movement. However, the ideas apply to it very well. And I'd like to use stuttering as an example of how the neurodiversity movement can be expanded to include more neurotypes. Neurodiversity is not the next politically correct way to refer to a certain constellation of disorders like autism, ADHD, and dyslexia. Rather, neurodiversity is a political concept, a category to add to intersectionality. In the same way that we all belong to a social class, we're all gendered and we're all raced, we all have variations in our neurological makeup. Neurodiversity does not place value on predetermined norms of structure and function, but on a diversity of structure and function. People of different neurotypes add value to society. Society is stronger because of neurodiversity. Importantly, neurodiversity has a nuance to recognize that all neurotypes come with benefits and challenges. The paradigm shift here is that we can address the challenges without normalizing the individual. To use stuttering as an example, I can help someone who stutters without making them fluent. The neurodiversity movement dares us to think critically about why people experience challenges. Is it inherent to being a neurominority, or is it due to society's inability to accommodate them? Do therapeutic and medical interventions aim to improve quality of life, or aim to make neurominorities appear more neurotypical?
Well, transition there, thank you. And so this is a quote from a paper that I wrote with Monique Botha, who, if you haven't read their work, you should go read it immediately. They're an autistic academic and activist and have done a really incredible work thinking about what it means to be an autism researcher who's autistic and the types of stigma that you have to face and the ways that the research community have been contributing to that stigma currently and in the past. And Monique is highlighting here the importance of learning from other rights movements, both within other disability communities and more broadly, to really move the neurodiversity movement's aims forward. And so as I mentioned, the neurodiversity movement is causing this amazing change that we see across the autism community and other communities, but it's also something that people battle a lot about what it means and who it represents. And so now we're going to turn to representation. And as Daniel mentioned, when Judy Singer developed the term neurodiversity with Harvey Bloom, she intended for it to be a new category of intersectionality. But when we said that, you probably wondered, well, what happened? Because we have a major issue in autism research with representation. And so people who are diverse in other ways are not represented in research. They struggle to get access to services. They struggle to even be identified as having autism in the first place. And these difficulties with access happen more at the intersections between multiple identities. And this issue is particularly terrible for trans autistic people who face heightened levels of the discrimination that trans people in general face in our society, including questions about whether they even know what their gender is, because they might not know who they are, that lead to them not being able to access gender affirming care. So these biases and stigma about intersecting identities cause heightened levels of suicidal behavior and suicide among trans autistic people. These issues affect autistic people with intellectual disabilities who are underrepresented in research, including research about intervention. So the issues that we have in the broader autism research community with the quality of autism intervention research, which make it hard to say what works for anyone, are particularly pronounced for people who need the most support because of these issues with representation. And these issues also really strongly affect non-speaking people. So non-speaking people are often not represented in research. They often don't have access to alternative and augmentative communication. And even when they gain access to alternative and augmentative communication, they often aren't believed that they're actually communicating. And so this is from a webinar that happened just this spring about non-speaking people, which was the first time non-speaking people were on a webinar of this type, largely thanks to advocacy by people that you'll see here, Vikram Jaswal, and Jordan Zimmerman and Grant Blasco. And I'm just going to show a very short clip of this, where you'll hear from Jordan about why access is so important.
I communicate by typing letter by letter on an iPad, which then speaks my words aloud. Thanks to the co-chairs for having me participate in this webinar. Now, before we get into the conversational aspect of this discussion, I am going to share some of my own lived experience as one non-speaking autistic person who has been called severe and profound, and as I do that, will include some research recommendations for consideration. While I am extremely honored to share with all of you, I want to point out that an estimated 30 to 40% of the more than 5 million autistic people like myself in the United States also rely on communication support, but most don't have it, as Light and McNaughton said yesterday. I am only one non-speaking autistic person, and while we may have some things in common, I can only share my experience alone, and do not, and cannot claim to represent more than a million others. As a young kid, I was put on a path of segregation. Places seemed to assume that, because I couldn't communicate reliably with speech, and had what they referred to as challenging behaviors, that they didn't need to make space for me. But as we know, legally, I had every right to be included in my school and community. Access to reliable communication should have been provided to me, but it should not have been a prerequisite for me to learn, play, or thrive. As Grant shared during the stakeholder panel yesterday, and which I relate to, this lack of communication caused a vicious cycle of trauma, which has impacted me deeply. This is all one reason researchers must prioritize communication support for young children who need it, as early as possible, and push legislation that increases inclusive practices, while decreasing segregation.
And you can also see a quote there from Grant Blasco, who we didn't get to see here, talking about what it feels like to be questioned about whether you're actually communicating at all, and highlighting a really key issue with any type of advocacy work and participatory work, which is one I struggle with as someone who struggles with time management, which is time. So providing time for people to communicate. If you, you can actually find this clip online, and we're happy to share our slides, which has a link to it. But you'll notice if you see how the people are communicating in this, that the people who are not non-speaking keep like wanting to say something. But there'll be this very long pause where people type out what they're trying to say. But actually that space to listen and learn and just reflect is something that really adds to all of our understanding of communication and advocacy. So the space non-speaking people give us, if we're willing to listen and make that space and take that time, is really important. And Grant's really highlighting here the importance of giving people time to prepare so that they can communicate effectively. And so now this is an image that Jin drew as one of the collaborators on the photo voice study that Wisdom is part of. And Jin was asked to think about what his job in the future would be. And Jin wrote that he really wanted to be a human being. And the reason that he wrote this is because he doesn't have a visa that allows him to work easily in the United States, despite being one of the most talented students I've ever seen in my life. And so he's currently entering a mental health counseling program at CSI, and I believe will be able to overcome this. But for someone this talented to encounter this type of discrimination throughout his youth is really horrible to see. And he highlights how it makes him feel not human. And this issue of being at the intersections of different identities and feeling like you're not human, like people don't recognize you as human, is a really important thing for all of us to know and consider carefully whenever we interact and develop services. So this is a quote from a really amazing folklorist and poet, and who was a professor but is since retired, who gave a speech at the Stanford Neurodiversity Conference that was one of the best speeches I've ever seen. He highlights that people can't even imagine me. They don't think that I exist. And he highlighted that that's the case in terms of how people think about autism and how people think about his other identities. And in his speech, he talks about how that type of trauma of being seen as not existing impacts his memory of himself throughout his life. So these issues with how we're discriminating against people and not recognizing their identities have very profound consequences in terms of mental health and access to support.
Participatory methods are one very big way to translate the neurodiversity movement's aims into action and to address the problems that Kristen was just talking about. They first emerged in 2006 in autism research with the aim of addressing the misconceptions born of 50-plus years of medical model research about autism, and it draws on Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed and was inspired by the neurodiversity movement. Since then, participatory methods have grown significantly and are gaining prominence in the autism field, though there's still quite a bit of work to do. One major setback that's not really inherent to the methodology of participatory methods is the neurodiversity light movement, which I mentioned earlier. Researchers will often put together advisory boards that are very, very minimalist and have no real say or sway in the research being conducted. And these researchers will think that these advisory boards are just the end-all, be-all. And this can lead to tokenizing, which a form of tick-the-box activism, which in any civil rights movement is very problematic. Truly participatory research positions members of the community being studied as the experts of their lived experience, and this ideally leads to democratic decision-making, which maximizes the participation of the community members. Participatory research varies along a continuum from not having any participatory methods at all to full and equal partnerships with community members directly affected by the research. Sometimes it can go one step further into community-led projects. It can also be an iterative process, with some studies gradually becoming more participatory over time, and some researchers who claim to be using participatory methods actually aren't really doing so in the best way possible. Some common issues in participatory research have to do with the power dynamics. So it can sometimes take a very hierarchical structure where people with any diagnosis seek help from an expert, so the ideal of democratic participation disappears. As mentioned earlier, tokenization and minimalist participation are very big problems, and in many cases, these stem from the fact that some non-autistic researchers are just not really interested in sharing power with the community members they're studying. Some people believe that participatory methods threaten the scientific process in autism research. They present self-advocacy and the push for participatory work as problematic and creating unnecessary tensions in the field. But this is not the view of everybody. Others believe that the inclusion of autistic voices in autism research presents an opportunity to drastically shift the field in a more inclusive direction. As an autistic researcher myself, this is very important to me, and I believe that these tensions are necessary to create meaningful change.
And so a lot of our work focuses on targeting biases because those biases have such profound impacts on identifying and mental health and other issues. And so a lot of the narratives surrounding autism focus on one type of autism, a white male from a middle-class family, and that creates issues with access to diagnosis and care, as we've talked about. And partially due to these difficulties, autistic people that have other identities face really profound mental health issues a lot of times. And biases among us, among clinicians and educators, contribute to those difficulties. And so a lot of our work focuses on that, on targeting the biases among us. And so in one study that we did recently, we compared a participatory training, or one developed in collaboration with autistic college students. You can see Nick and Billy there. That highlights their experiences and targets things that they think are important, with one that was developed without substantive autistic input. And as we had hypothesized, we found that the participatory training was more effective in reducing stigma and increasing knowledge and positive attitudes toward inclusion than the non-participatory training. And then in more recent work, we adapted this approach to educate educators. So higher education faculty in the United States and the UK and Australia. My primary collaborator on this study was T.C. Weissman, but there was a really vibrant team of collaborators on the study. This is one of my favorite studies that I've been a part of, that included 8 autistic researchers and 7 non-autistic researchers from around the world. And this is a clip from the training from one of our collaborators, Dr. Stephen Shore.
Hi everyone. Just sharing a few thoughts about how educational planning for individuals with learning differences ends up benefiting all students. For example, I'm commonly alerted by the Student Support Office of a pupil needing a copy of my lecture notes from a course I'm teaching, or perhaps an advanced organizer. I don't know why they just don't call it an agenda, to help prepare the student for the course material. After informing the office that I always have the period's agenda and slides available online for all students, I then quickly get a return email saying that nothing further needs to be done. Another example of preparing for all learning styles brings to mind when a student disclosed to me that his ADHD resulted in laboriously slow and mostly illegible handwriting, resulting in poor grades for in-class writing assignments, and this would doom him to fail the latest project of describing components of an electronic music lab and how they work together. He thought for a few moments, and then requested that he be allowed to draw a map of the electronic music studio instead of writing it out. This alternative approach to demonstrating mastery made perfect sense to me, as I then realized my goal was to assess for mastery of content rather than how fast or neatly he could write. This seemed to be a much better strategy than suggesting he drop the course and return later after practicing penmanship. In fact, the strategy of mapping rather than writing about the electronic music lab was so intriguing to me that I included this as a permanent option for this assignment. We have so much to learn from our students. We only need to observe and listen. Especially poignant is that I already knew this student understood the electronic music lab better than his classmates and was even more facile in some aspects of the equipment than I. So it was a matter of forcing a student into a preconceived notion of subject mastery and him failing the assignment, or I could empower him to demonstrate his ability in the best way he knew how.
You're really a natural at deciding when to transition. This is wonderful. It's perfect. And so this study was the first time that we evaluated if the impacts of our training lasted after the training ended. So in prior research, like the study we just reported on, the participatory study with college students, we just assessed what people had learned right after the training. And we'd done a lot of work in this area and published a lot of papers, and we were really worried that we might have like a Wizard of Oz phenomena when we're like, yay, we're affecting stigma, but really it just would dissipate right away. And so this is a quasi-experimental design. So this means that these effects that we see, we can't be sure they're due to the training, but we did see that a month after post-test, improvements in knowledge and positive attitudes toward inclusion and stigma maintained, although the improvements in stigma were starting to decrease, which is important to note. And so this work was really exciting for us, but there's a lot that we still need to do to build on it. One of the things we highlight in the paper is that this work, you don't just come in and do a one is done and then do a series of trainings and then people are set to go. This really needs to be a community of practice. So you need to do trainings like this and have opportunities for people to discuss and learn from one another and continue to grow together. So this is just the first step. And also this work is not yet nearly as intersectional as we think it should be. So the training itself needs to be adapted.
So there are quite a few challenges in developing neurodiversity affirmative supports. And autistic people often face significant barriers in employment and educational opportunities, particularly for non-speaking autistic people, as the coordinators of RCAS know very well. And currently many interventions fail to address this issue, instead focusing on deficits and normalizing. Although these interventions are designed to help autistic people succeed, it creates an unfair situation. We are expected to look and act neurotypical, but we're not. So neurotypical methods for life success don't work for us. And when we try to use methods that work for us, we're punished and told that's not the right way to do it. So we are expected to be successful using methods that don't allow us to be successful. Hence, these barriers in education, employment, many other facets of life arise. One way our lab has been trying to remedy this is by designing and running a game design and employment workshop for autistic high school and college students. The workshop aims to engage autistic students who have an interest in game design in informal STEM learning opportunities, as well as to teach them employment skills essential for building self-determination, self-efficacy, and problem solving. Our guiding principles are to do this in a neurodiversity affirmative way and to avoid ableism. One major way that we work to uphold these principles is by engaging a participatory group. The group meets monthly and consists of neurodivergent students in various levels of education. We have high school students, we have undergrad and grad students, as well as the core research team. Small disclosure, I am actually a member of this group and not the core research team. We use a very democratic decision process developed by Aspire, which is flexible and iterative, and we take a vote on the different aspects of the workshop curriculum and the research plan. We also prioritize neurodivergent votes. So if the whole group, neurodivergent and core team, votes to approve a measure, but the neurodivergent members themselves vote not to approve it, the measure is considered not approved. Since I wasn't involved in year one, I'll let Kristen explain it.
So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about this study, but it's a 3-year study, and the aim of the first year was to learn from students what they found engaging. So we had pre-test and post-test assessments before and after a workshop, and then during it, students rated their engagement with specific instructional activities. And then we really quickly revised to try to learn from the students before conducting a second workshop. And then in year 2, we expanded the first workshop, which focused on game design, to include much more of a focus on employment. And year 3, which is where we're going right now, will be a randomized design. We just started assessments for it yesterday, actually, where students are randomized to either the first workshop or the second, so that we can say if the workshop leads to improvements. And we'll continue to learn from students throughout about what they find engaging. And this year we're collaborating with a really talented neurodivergent-led collective in Canada called Soft Chaos. So in year 2 of our study, we made a lot of progress in terms of our participatory approach, as Daniel was speaking about, and we had a lot more autistic input on our learning objectives, on our curriculum. But there were some very sudden transitions in the leadership of one of our collaborating organizations that made it very hard to enact those participatory approaches. And this is really important to highlight, is that participatory approaches aren't a Band-Aid to solve difficulties, but they can teach us a lot about how to be more effective in our participatory approach going forward. And the issues that we faced are actually documented throughout the participatory research literature. People are documenting these types of challenges that we'll talk about here.
So what we did in year 2, we presented the outcomes from year 1 and previous research about employment skills to the participatory group. And this is where the value of the participatory group really came forward. One of the proposed workshop modules, was labeled Identifying Appropriate Workplace Conversation. Some members of the group, however, became concerned that this module could easily veer into ableism, since mainstream interventions often make the term appropriate synonymous with the term neurotypical, thus posing natural autistic traits as inappropriate. However, the students in year 2 enrolled in year 2 expressed an interest in learning about this. So we changed it to workplace dynamics, which everyone involved found acceptable. We did run into some tensions regarding core values and honoring participatory feedback in practice. Not everybody shared the same core principles, and so there was a breakdown in communication. We remedied this by defining neurodiversity affirmative principles and listing them so that all group members could review them and commit to them. We use these principles to guide staff selection and staff trainings to make sure the workshop staff would be aware of and willing to commit to these principles in practice. We iteratively created and revised our research practices, and during the participatory meetings, we instigated a role called the protector of the participatory research. This person was responsible for making sure that everyone in the group had a chance to contribute, since some members were more active than others. The principles we used were drawn directly from the neurodiversity movement. The first one, very basic, nothing about us without us. It's the autistic people should guide research decisions about autism, very basic. Strengths-based approach, which is about highlighting autistic strengths rather than deficits, while also recognizing that everyone has their own unique strengths and challenges and will need their own unique supports. Valuing community diversity is about creating a space where people of all backgrounds can actively contribute, and to let this guide our methods and teaching. Valuing all forms of communication and engagement, so we do not prioritize one single form of communication. Workshop students are allowed to communicate and engage in any way they choose. Providing multiple paths for learning. So if a student is unable to understand any part of the curriculum, the onus is on the workshop staff to adapt the curriculum so that the student understands it, rather than asking the student to adapt themselves to fit the curriculum. These principles are presented to and agreed upon by all members of the participatory group, the core research team, and the workshop staff, so all of us have promised to commit to and uphold these principles.
And so what we really want you to take away from that example is that participatory approaches are what we think the future of the field is, participatory and autistic-led work. But it's difficult, and it's iterative, and it's challenging, and you need to learn a lot as you go. And the field is still very early in this process. So being transparent about what the challenges are will allow us all to learn from one another how to move forward. And as you can see throughout this talk, one of the key things that we think serves a protective effect against the discrimination and mental health issues that neurodivergent people face is autistic solidarity. And learning one is autistic can be incredibly empowering. It can also be really complex. It can lead people to feel joy and a lot of relief is the most commonly documented emotion. It can also lead to sorrow and shame and all kinds of different emotions. So learning one is autistic is both complex and empowering. And one of the key ways it's empowering is it opens opportunities to connect with other neurodivergent people and build autistic solidarity and work together toward the type of future that we're working toward here and at CUNY and that we all want to see happen. So we want to empower people to feel proud that they're autistic, but we realize that's not going to be the case for everyone. And so now you're going to see a clip from Bella. We're just going to show part of this clip. And Bella is another one of our key lead researchers in Project Reach, who started out as a mentee, became a mentor, and then a leader of the skills development group, and a researcher who's done qualitative coding with people all over the world. She was one of the collaborators on the faculty study, and she was training the faculty how to code. So we're just going to see a little bit of this research. Too. And Daniel's research as well.
My name is Bella Kaufman. I am an autistic person myself who recently graduated from CSI with a master's in education and currently working as a teacher. I was in the Project Reach program where I transitioned from being a mentee to a mentor and co-led the structured group meetings. Now I would like to hear from you. I would like to ask you this question. If you had an autistic child, when would you start to talk to them about being autistic? Dr. Ariana Riccio did a study on autistic identity with autistic advocates and the mother of an autistic teenager. The study focused on whether parental disclosure decisions influenced autistic teenagers' perceptions of their autism and their autism identity. Findings showed that teenagers whose parents told them about their autism diagnosis had more positive perspectives of themselves and their autism in adulthood than those whose parents never disclosed to them. I co-led a study on whether learning one's autism early in life will lead to better outcomes in adulthood among autistic college students. The first hypothesis for the study was that learning one's autism at a younger age will be associated with heightened well-being and quality of life. Another hypothesis was that learning one's autism at a younger age will be associated with more positive perspectives on autism. The table on the left shows the information on participants. For example, the majority of participants were white and male. Many participants were on the sexual and gender minorities. The table on the right shows how important it is for parents to disclose to their children about their autism diagnosis early in life so that they can grow up to have a positive quality of life and well-being.
So this study was really fascinating to us, and it's really resonated with the research community and the broader autistic community. A lot of people have reached out to me to share this with clinicians and family members. I should, however, note that people tried to independently replicate it in a non-college student sample, and while they found that age of learning one is autistic was related to quality of life and baseline correlations, it wasn't related once they controlled for other factors. That paper just actually came out today. So this is something that's very complicated. Disclosing autism is incredibly complicated, but one of the key recommendations from all of our autistic collaborators, which resonates with research with autistic mothers, is that it's better to talk about autism in neurodiversity affirmative ways as early as possible, so that it's recognized as a valuable part of your identity and not something that's introduced when you start to run into challenges. I feel like a dolphin trying to do sonar. Have you guys heard of the orcas that are capsizing the boats? I love it.
Level of the child's understanding and how how to explain to the children.
And Bella is currently a teacher, so she graduated from CSI and became a teacher, which was her dream job. And she's still very much a part of our community, as Daniel mentioned. Cool. And so a follow-up to that study was led by an autistic undergrad for his honors thesis. And Kyle was interested in understanding if parental discussions about autism influenced how people think about autism, as we'd found in prior work, but also if characteristics of autistic people might influence how they understand autism. And so the students in this study were drawn from that NSF-funded workshop, the workshops in the first years of the study, and the students completed an interview and surveys, and the parents completed just a survey. And then the students also completed a bunch of cognitive game-based tests. And here you can see Kyle sharing his reasons for developing his hypotheses. And you can see the real value of lived expertise in research about autism and autistic identity. He had understandings of what could influence how people develop their identity that people who were not autistic would not have. And you can also see how he inferred that he was autistic. Most likely his mother had put that book for him to discover. But that allowed him to take on a very empowered role in his own identity. And so this is a really important thing to note, which is that when students are asked to define autism, this is something we see across studies, they highlight difficulties. This isn't surprising because of how autism is defined in the medical model and the diagnostic criteria. But you can see that they're not highlighting strengths, they're highlighting difficulties. And you can also see that very few of them are connecting autism to themselves. And this is something we see in a lot of research with adolescents. A lot of them don't know they're autistic. They might not have been told they're autistic, or they haven't incorporated that into their identity if they do know it. And so this is where we got the title for our talk. This is one of my favorite quotes that a student gave during the workshop. And so you can see that this really highlights the central idea of the neurodiversity movement, which is often misrepresented as saying that autistic people just want to be recognized in terms of strengths. People in the neurodiversity movement have diverse perspectives, but most neurodiversity advocates view autism as both a source of strength and a source of challenges. And we need to recognize the strengths and build from them in addressing the challenges. And so this adolescent is highlighting that in this beautiful quote. And so it's important when we think about autistic identity to recognize that autistic people have multiple identities. Our work in this area has really just focused on autistic identity for the most part. We've just begun to think about how identities intersect. And they embody and juggle these identities, and these autistic communities that emerge from exploring these identities are often really radical spaces, where norms about binaries and ways of thinking about identity development that people might grow up with are really challenged in ways that empower neurodivergent people, but that can also teach us all about the fluidity of identity development and the possibilities that we've only begun to imagine. So we want to support these spaces, these radical spaces. While we want to support these spaces, we also really need to recognize that there's different ways of thinking about autism. So Decker, who was one of the founders of the group where Judy Singer and Harvey Bloom developed the idea of neurodiversity, highlighted that the idea was never meant to exclude people who don't think autism is a cursed gift. They just think it's a curse. They want it to be cured. So he wanted there to be space in the neurodiversity movement for people who have any perspective on autism. And so we have to recognize when we're trying to support people, we want to help them develop positive autistic identities, but we want to make spaces where you don't have to identify. You don't have to be diagnosed. We want to combat stigma. We want to have multiple spaces for people to come, because if it's an autism-only space, people who feel that way about autism are probably not going to show up. And so that's one of the key things about Project REACH, is our space was developed for autistic people, funded by the FAR Fund, and is free for students because of the funding from the FAR Fund. Also open to students who don't identify as autistic. And we think that's really important because of this discrimination and because of these differences in access. And we also need to be really creative. So as I mentioned, participatory work is very much in its infancy, and a lot of it relies on speech-based communication, even though people could type, it's very language-based. And so we need to be really creative in how we think about doing research and supporting people, and develop much more open ways to communicate that I think we haven't even really begun to envision. I see this as one of the primary frontiers in autism work, is thinking about communication much more broadly than we think about it, and creating new ways for people to communicate and impact and represent. And we also need to learn from people who've been doing this work. So the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network has been doing incredible work, which we've learned so much from in our work. But they've also been critiqued for issues with representation, for the fact that a lot of their leaders are white men. And they've responded to that by developing an equity plan where they dialogue with the community and reflect every year on their process and progress toward better supporting people who are intersectional in multiple ways. So we really need to learn from the people who've been doing this. And this is a quote that I really love that highlights what we're seeing here today with this center and the work that we're doing at CUNY and the work that's happening all over the world under the banner of the neurodiversity movement, which is that we're part of a broader struggle for justice. And the more that we recognize that and build those alliances across identities, both within the disability communities and more broadly, the more effective we'll be in creating the change that we're seeing happen, but that needs to happen on such a broader level than it's happened thus far. And so I'm so thrilled to see the work that you're doing here. And now we want to learn from you.
Is by asking you to share a way that you would like to change your community to help autistic people thrive.
And so we realized Menti would not work before the talk, so we're going to do raising your hand. Sorry. So if anyone would like to share. Thank you. That's wonderful, and there's so little work in that area. So people could share insights or questions.
I wish that as a faculty member, every time I noticed a student who seemed to me to perhaps be on the spectrum or perhaps have severe ADD, I wish that I could refer to them to this space or one like it and know that they would not be turned away. And it sounds like maybe we've made progress in that. I'm just thinking of several students I taught this semester who really needed support. And when I reached out to, the regular advising system was told, well, I've got 700 on my list. Good luck. Here's a book you can read. It sounds like maybe that's beginning to change through the money that's going to be invested in the center. But I wish that we're more true here already. I wish it were more true at other campuses. But maybe we will see that happen. Mm-hmm.
I wish we could bring that training on working with students with neurodiverse students to campus, and with that frame that we're all neurodiverse.
And you can, it's an open access training. So the intention with it is for people to be able to adapt it to their community.
One of the things that I'm doing, I'm a graduate student over in psychology, but I also teach at a neurodivergent high school for students who have special needs. And during COVID, I noticed that some of especially my autistic students, were doing a lot better on Zoom-based training than they did in the class. And so I'm currently doing research to show that autistic people might benefit from either pre-recorded or Zoom-based training versus in-person lecture hall type stuff. And I think that we're going to find that ADHD people also tend to do better with that as well, just because of the distractions in the room.
We found similar things in Project Reach. A lot of students prefer online, and then some really prefer in person. It's really an individual difference, but having that is really, really important.
I love how you said time management, to include that and to have different types of communication, because I work with different people with disabilities. I have a wonderful blind ballet teacher, and she talks about crip time all the time, where she has to be constantly reminded about what time of the day it is or how far she is into class, so she wouldn't go on forever as she always would love to do. So I think that once we start to educate people more about taking more time to communicate, giving people space to pause, and also to understand that there's many different forms of communication. So thank you for all your points on that.
So my name is Dina Pagnosi, and I'm the director of the Rutgers University Inn and Conference Center. And we've worked with Chris and his team to create meaningful employment partnerships with folks at this facility. And our dream is that we would continue that momentum, because there are real opportunities for training in the hospitality industry that could be for New Brunswick, New Jersey, and beyond.
We got to see that in practice a little bit yesterday, and it was amazing. We were really impressed.
Hi, I'm Shirley Taylor from the FAR Fund, and I couldn't be prouder of our grantees. The work they're doing is incredible. And I think for me, the dream is that programs like Project Reach and like Rutgers could be at every college campus around the world, because what I'd really like to see is for everyone to be able to reach their full potential. And we really see this, right, with individuals, even autistic individuals, when they get into college, then they can't. They don't have the support they need to succeed, and that's incredibly frustrating. And the other place is on the job market, that we're graduating lots more college students and young adults with degrees, and then they can't get jobs. They're just sitting at home, and that's tragic. So I hope that the whole world becomes more accommodating to everybody, and that people can get what they need to be successful and to really reach their full potential. So.
And thank you so much, Shirley, for funding us. So Shirley and the FAR Fund intended to fund us only for 3 years, and it's been but whenever I meet someone who's doing cool work in this area, I always, I had no idea that this was partially funded by the FAR Fund. The FAR Fund's always behind the innovation. So thank you for your insight in how you pick.
Hi, I'm Kim Spinelli from Gazap Communications. I would love to see more accessibility, incorporation, perhaps incentivization to use wellness activities. Something we talk about pervasively at Gazap is the 8 dimensions of wellness model, the holistic adaptation of embracing wellness to prevent mental illness or help manage it effectively. And I'm sure you're familiar with the statistics on the comorbidity of conditions in the ASD population. So I think that would be beneficial for the common good, but particularly for this marginalized population.
Hello. My name is Marianne. I'm the mother of an adult son with autism, and I'm a recent graduate with my master's in ABA. I'm interested in the lifespan issues, and you raised the issue of at what age do parents tell their children, and the siblings and the cousins and the community, and how can we support the betterment of quality of life by approaching this, in the family way. And that carries forth through their adulthood and through their jobs and their future housing, as we've discussed.
So I'm just going to put our thank you slide up, because I never get to it due to my time management issues.